Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
We know that Moses is reaching his final moments. Soon we will read of his passing, we'll read of his burial, we'll read how Israel mourns, and we'll read his eulogy. And of course, that's going to raise the question of who wrote that? If Moses has already died, who's writing about the burial and about the people mourning and about the eulogy? Who wrote the end of the Torah? It sparks thousands of years of discussion and debate. Who wrote the Torah is not a new academic question. This is a question that we find in the Talmud. This is a question we find 2,000 years ago because we're reading the end of the Torah and we're saying, well, Moses didn't write that. So who wrote that? And it immediately gets raised as a question of debate. When we reach the modern world, academia adds its voice to the question. It doesn't innovate the question. And when we look at how does the academic world address the question of who wrote the Bible, first of all, it answers it by saying that sources. There were different sources. There wasn't one book. There were several sources that came through time, and then an editor came and put it all together. And it's the working theory in academia of how we get the Bible. And the thing is, like all working theories, it's going to answer some of the questions we have, but it's not going to be able to answer all of the questions we have. And it remains a theory because we have no evidence. We have no proof. We have not found archaeological evidence of the academic theories. So it's our working theory, but it actually still remains a theory. When we look at the answers outside of academia, how does Judaism actually answer that question if we're asking the question? We look first of all at the most traditional of everything, and that is where we head to our sources. We look in the Talmud, and it says that in fact, Moses wrote every word. That's the beginning of a very traditional response. Moses wrote every word, and it was dictated by God. And then we move to less traditional responses that say Moses wrote every word, but it wasn't dictated. It was through divine revelation. And that's how Moses knew to write every word. And then we look again, and we see there are even less traditional responses that say that it wasn't divine that God was inspiring and revealing it to Moses, is that Moses was inspired. But actually the words may not be divine, the inspiration was divine. And then we get to the least traditional of all answers that says Moses actually had nothing to do with it. And so we're looking at the spectrum from Moses actually every single word all the way through to the possibilities where we would say, no, Moses had nothing to do with it. And then we divide ourselves into all the different communities that we have today based on this question. How do we view how we got the Torah? And that begins to define our communities. In truth, as we've just said, the questions themselves are not modern. The divisions are modern. The idea that we'll divide into communities and label those communities, that's a modern concept. And that we will align those communities with how we answer that one question, that's a modern concept. And we're playing with ancient ideas and moving them into divisiveness. When we look in the Talmud's asked who wrote those last few verses, and the answer is Joshua did. Joshua's the next leader. He's already been appointed. He's already the one stepping into Moses' shoes. He is the one who wrote those last verses, and the Talmud says that. But what the Talmud has done is it's opened the possibility of being able to say someone else was involved in the process. So whether we say it's Joshua or anyone else, the Talmud has opened that door. Someone else outside of Moses was involved in the process of writing down the Torah. By the time we get to the 11th century, Abraham ibn Ezra, whom I'm a big fan of his, he thinks outside the box. He's a radical, and he has the courage to write things down to a point. And we're going to hear how he approached it, because he lists in his commentary something that he calls the secret 12. And then he lists 12 verses throughout the Torah where he is saying Moses could not have written those. And part of the verses are the eulogy. And he's saying, these are the secret 12 where we would know. And he raises the question, could Moses have written those? And then he says something remarkable. He says, Hamaskil Yavin. The one who has reached a level of intelligence will understand what I'm saying. So in other words, he says, I'm not spelling this out. The one who gets it, look at those verses. You'll figure out what I'm saying. And what he's saying is, Moses could not have written them. And then he gets to the point in discussing it where he says, Hamaskil Yidom. The one who understands what I'm saying should keep their mouths shut. They should be quiet about it. In other words, here's what I'm saying happened. It wasn't entirely Moses. You and I figured that out. Don't tell anybody else. And now we have what we see as medieval thinking coming into the commentaries. The medieval fear of organized religion. Don't tell the masses things that could get them thinking outside the box. That's how you would define the whole medieval era. And we're hearing it with Ibn Ezra because he's figured something out and he's afraid to share it. And our commentaries are never afraid to share thoughts about Torah. So we begin to hear this idea of don't ask the question too out loud and don't share your opinions too out loud. But what's interesting is that we have other authoritative commentaries in the Torah, like Radak, who agrees with Ibn Ezra and says, yeah, look at those 12. I think it raises a serious question if we say Moses wrote it all and I got those 12 verses where I got a problem with it. And then the whole thing shuts down with Maimonides. Maimonides, Rambam, comes up and says, I am giving you 13 principles of faith. And one of them says, Moses wrote the whole Torah, so don't even question it. Because if you question it, that's a question of your faith. You're stepping outside of the group, outside of the people. Except we know Maimonides was an elitist, and he did very much believe in the elite thinkers and then the masses. And we don't want to tell the masses too much, it will confuse them. We actually have writings from a student of Maimonides that raises the question of if even Maimonides believed that. So we're left again with this very ancient question that keeps going round and round. And we get to the point in the modern world where we're using that question to define who we think is more Jewish and less Jewish, which is honestly, these are phrases we can't even make sense of Jewishly, because you can't be more or less, but we talk about it that way. The answer to who do you think wrote the Bible in our minds will create a category of Judaism. That the person who's answering it, in our minds, we've put them into a certain category. And we've gotten to the point politically today where one community will reject sound Jewish reasoning of another community only because of how they think they answered the question of who wrote the Torah. Not because their reasoning is not Jewish, not because they don't have the authority of how they got there, only because of how they answer that question. The walls go higher, the divides get larger, and we've gotten to the point where we're bringing the question back. And today in Israel, in very right-wing Orthodox yeshivas, the heads of the yeshivas are being confronted by their students saying, have you seen Ibn Ezra? Have you looked at Radak? How do we answer this question? And now we're hearing them come out and saying, the answer is the Torah is the work of Elohim Chaim, of a living God. We're all arguing about the filter. We're all arguing about how did it filter down. We should stop arguing about that. The Torah is the work of a living God, the living God. And as with life, the Torah will grow, the Torah will transform, and the Torah will renew itself. That's how we understand it, because that's our definition of life, and God is a living God, so the whole thing connects through. No one in Judaism believes that God wrote the Torah. No one. We know that whatever God did write did not make it down Sinai. Moses broke it. So we don't have anything that God wrote. We all accept that. We all know that the Torah is the product of a human hand. We all accept that as well. We're really arguing about degrees. Was it dictated? Was it inspired? Was it Moses? Was it every word? Was it Joshua filling in words? We're arguing about degrees of minutia. We're ignoring how much we agree with each other, and we're focusing on the details that we are picking up of disagreement. We all, as Jews, agree that the Torah is our core document, that it holds within it eternal truths, essential values of life that has saved us and anchors us forever through our history and as we move forward. We've always debated the question, who wrote the Torah, because we're supposed to debate the question, who wrote the Torah. The Torah is not clear. It should have said, and the Torah was written by, and it doesn't, which means it's inviting the question. We're supposed to be debating it. It's a debate that underlines inclusion of all opinions. We weren't meant to scare each other into silence about it. That's medieval thinking. And that's what will divide us. And we end up with risking a Jewish people that divides over the question. The question keeps us engaged with the Torah. It keeps us learning from each other. It keeps us struggling with concepts of God. It's exactly what we're supposed to do, in the hope that we finally arrive at the place where we understand that the diversity of Jewish opinion is what unites us. It should never be what divides us. Shabbat Shalom.